Remember, remember, the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason, and plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Today is the 5th of November, the day we celebrate the survival of King James I, the man who gave us the authorized version of the Bible, better known today, especially in America, as the King James Version of the Bible. Though quite contrary to the way some people put it, he was not arrogant and didn't name the Bible after himself. It was actually called the Authorized Version, because it was the one authorized to be read within the Church of England. In addition to that, he also was nearly assassinated by a Catholic radical and a group of Catholic conspirators, hoping to overthrow the Protestant government of England to install a Catholic monarchy. Infamously, this would be Guy Fawkes, who now is known as the inspiration for the mask for V for Vendetta, because he was used as that, although that film depicts him as some sort of anarchist fighting for freedom against factism, a word I can't really use on this channel. My name is S.K. Williams, and I am celebrating Bonfire Night, the night where the King and Parliament narrowly escaped being blown to pieces. Now keep in mind, even though modern narratives often oversimplify history and we talk about things in very simple terms like religion causes violence and war, we should have secular government. Keep in mind we have the secular terrorists trying to overthrow secular governments because they don't hold the correct ideal, and there's no reason to think religion is more violent than secularism other than the fact that we like to say it is. In fact, I'm actually quite convinced that the distinction between what makes something a religion and what makes it secular is arbitrary and not particularly helpful in understanding why people do anything, especially if you try and make religion about belief in a god, which people today do, but also ignore that when they want to demonize something and use the narrative of religion being violent to dismiss some sort of violent thing from something like them. A good example of that would be how it's very common for sociopathic militant atheists to say religion is this horrible thing that dominates society, creates authoritarianism, is tribeless, and of course leads to violence and war, whilst secular government would lead to peace and prosperity. And when people point to the Soviet Union, especially in answer to the idea that not just secularism, but a secular ideal where we largely are non-religious and are atheists, we would have a peaceful world if everyone was atheist instead of religious, because atheism is, of course, the opposite of religion. Well, you can point to things like the Soviet Union, you can point to things like communist China and other communist countries that practice Marxism, and all of a sudden, they're not true atheists. They're actually religious. Because even though it's impossible for an atheist to be religious, after all, by definition, atheism is a lack of belief in a god, and a lack of belief can't be a religion. And even though it's literally impossible for an atheist to be religious, precisely because atheists lack belief in a god, and by definition religion is belief in and reverence of gods and supernatural powers, the communists were actually religious. Of course, some try and justify that by saying the communists worship the state as a god, therefore they count as theists, but it's obvious that this is actually just interpreting history through a predetermined narrative, and obviously is there to meet desired goals. It's why Kavanaugh pointed out how silly this sort of thing is, the idea that religion is automatically a cause of warfare, violence, and division, and is largely there to justify our own ideas of secularism in the secular state, as well as modern democracy. But in reality, when you look at the gunpowder plot, it wasn't a simple matter of a group of Catholic conspirators, notably Guy Fawkes, being of a different religion than the people he wanted to kill, They disagreed theologically, and he just wanted to kill them because of that disagreement. There were actually very pointed social objections, and many of them were actually valid on the part of Guy Fawkes, such as disabilities that were placed upon Catholics within the Kingdom of England at the time. And you may say that still proves the point, because those disabilities were put on them for what they believed. They had a different religious belief. But you have to understand that people don't kill people just over private disagreement over beliefs, but over various other things that they would hold important. And even in secular societies, where people don't allow religion to get involved in the state, you have ideological conflicts that arise, and there's absolutely no reason to think the ideological conflicts that emerge in secular societies do so because one of those ideologies is actually secretly a religion. It's fairly obvious that humans will fight over disagreements of beliefs, and more importantly, how those beliefs will lead people to behave in the long run. For example, the difference between Catholic and Protestant isn't just esoteric theological differences that contain nothing but an ether or an afterlife, but rather contain obvious social polities as well, because Catholic social teaching would actually entail certain different types of laws to be created. If you were actually building a Catholic government, that would not be implemented if you put into practice certain forms of Protestantism. It was never really about simply, I don't agree with your supernatural beliefs, therefore I am going to kill you. There's always more to it than that when it comes to any conflict. And when you really think about it, our supposedly non-religious time period has had far more actual fighting happening between atheist groups who don't have very much disagreement on how they understand the world. Look at the recent American Atheist versus Freedom from Religion Foundation conflict, both of which, of course, are 501c3 tax-exempt atheist organizations that atheists pretend either don't exist or are not tax-exempt because only religion is tax-exempt, and that's why religion is evil for ignoring the law and violating separation of church and state, whilst they themselves do the same thing. In reality, I don't really think this idea that we have some people who are religious and other people who are not, and that atheists are not religious and they're the opposite of religion, and that secular government is neutral toward religion, none of that's actually really the truth, nor is it particularly helpful in determining causes of violence. Because when you really look at the causes of violence, they're not based on whether or not someone believes in and worships gods and supernatural powers, but are always predicated on other actual things that connect to those beliefs. Furthermore, you can believe in and reverence gods and supernatural powers while being a pacifist. There are pacifistic religions. There are even pacifistic forms of Christianity. After all, when's the last time you heard of a Quaker or Amish terrorist attack? I know we're supposed to think of Christians as crusades, inquisition, witch hunts, and killing different people for heresy. But that's really a reductive idea, and it still ignores the fact that even though the excuse will be they didn't kill in the name of atheism, we still have secular and even atheistic ideologies where people have been perfectly willing to kill people over disagreements on beliefs. And let's face reality, even if we were to accept that atheism is, by definition, a lack of belief in a God, and that atheists don't actually believe there is no God, but simply lack belief because they've not been shown evidence, and even if we were to accept that all the deaths that occurred in the Soviet Union had nothing to do with the atheism because no one killed in the name of merely lacking belief, and even accepting that atheism is the opposite of religion, it still doesn't make sense to say religion is inherently more violent. If everyone was an atheist, we would have a more peaceful world, when we've actually seen people who merely lacked belief in a God due to insufficient evidence murdering millions of people. Of course, atheism is not a lack of belief in a God, it's a belief there is no God. It's fairly obvious that the very people who insist that we define atheism as a lack of belief in a God claim God doesn't exist on a regular basis. I am not confused about the definition of the word atheism, and I know that A means without, theism means belief in a God, and you put those together, you get without belief in a God. I know that's the same thing as lack of belief in a God, so when an atheist tells me there you're confused, A means without, theism means belief in a God, put those together, you get without belief in a God, or in other words, lack of belief there. I hope that helps. It doesn't help, because I already understand that, and it's a lie. Especially since if you look on the etymology of the term atheism, the original definition of atheism does not go back 3,000 years to the Greek word atheos, which meant lack of belief in a god. No one in ancient Greece understood the word atheos to mean lack of belief in a god. No one understood that in the 1500s either. The simple reality is the etymology does not support the A is without, theism is belief in a god, put those together, without belief in a god is what you get. Therefore, atheism means lack of belief. It just doesn't. And absolutely no one understood atheism as a lack of belief in a god until Anthony Flew redefined it in the 1970s anyway, and even the evidence that people did, like Bertrand Russell's teapots being about if someone claims there's teapots between Earth and Mars, then he has the burden of proof to show the teapots, not the one who lacks belief in the teapots, proving that Bertrand Russell understood atheism as a lack of belief. Well, that's a lie, too, because I've read Bertrand Russell's teapots, and his point was not that if someone claims there's teapots orbiting between Earth and Mars, that the burden of proof is on him, not on the one who lacks belief. As an analogy to believing in God, Bertrand Russell's actual point was that the belief that there are teapots between Earth and Mars is stupid and should be rejected, and all sane people do reject it, but they don't reject belief in God, which is equally silly, stupid, and obviously not true, simply because a really old book said so when we built our society on that really old book, and no one questions it. His point was not to define atheism as a lack of belief in a God, but to call people stupid for believing in God, and to blame tradition on the continuation of belief in God. But atheists don't seem to really care about actual facts these days, even though they're the ones who go about talking about facts and logic, TM, so... Nevertheless, I really don't think that religious violence is particularly worse than secular violence. I don't think if there's a conflict between a religious belief and a secular belief system, that it's always the religion that is at fault. I don't really think that secular ideologies never come into conflict with secular ideologies, and I really don't think that secular violence is in any way less damaging. I know the great Hector Avalos, brilliant atheist Bible scholar, said so. He even pointed out how religious violence is worse, but he did so by a lot of wordplay that just really didn't make sense if you think about it logically. Which I'm not allowed to say because I'm a religious person and I don't use logic, not like those brilliant atheists. But when you think about it, his whole argument is predicated on the idea that religious violence is worse and more damaging than non-religious violence, because it's predicated on beliefs that you can't show to be real. Even accepting his premise that religious belief can't be shown to be real because it's based on faith, which by definition is belief without evidence because atheists say so, and if you tell them that's not what the word faith means, you're wrong, and Hebrews 11:1 gives the religious definition of faith as belief without evidence because atheists say so, and you can't disagree because it's the plain reading of the text because atheists say so, and if you disagree, you're using mental gymnastics. Well, here's the problem. Even accepting all of that, even accepting that faith is believing something with no evidence, and all religion is based on faith, Avalos is arguing that religious violence is worse, not simply morally, but actually worse physically. But his argument for why it's worse is because it's based on believing things you have no evidence for and can't show exist, which doesn't prove the actual violence is worse, it only proves the motivation for the violence is worse if you accept his chain of thought. Then again, his chain of thought is entirely Marxist in its principles. I'm not just saying that because he's an atheist and I think all atheists are Marxist because I'm a stupid, delusional religious man. I'm saying that because the entire argument actually comes from Marx and Engels. It's not really Hector Avalos' argument at all. All he did was throw over it the concept of religion onto it. Because the original concept of the scarce resource model for violence did not come from Hector Avalos. It came from Marx and Engels in their works such as Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. other collected essays. All he did was simply take the scarce resource theory for violence and add the word religion to it, and created a bizarre idea that people took way more seriously than it deserved to be. Granted, academically, it wasn't really as serious as people thought. Avalos is not cited often, and his predictive model made no actual predictions, which kind of undermines it. His theory is predicated on the idea that religion creates scarce resources, which of course assumes religion is not true, because atheism is true. Something Avalos doesn't actually have to show any evidence for, because, well, atheism is by definition a nothing burger. It's a lack of belief in a God. So we can just assert God doesn't exist and not have to back that up. Because, after all, he's Hector Avalos. But religion is all made-up fairy tales that create scarce resources. But the way he defined scarce resources made absolutely no sense, because he said the scarce resources that religion creates, it creates scarce resources in 4 ways. And only one of those is actually true. And that would be sacred spaces, like churches, temples, mosques, things like that being built. Because physical property being used for something is a limited resource. So if I were to take land and build a church on it, you can't build something else there unless you tear the church down, or unless you decide to repurpose the church. It is a limited resource because it is land. But religion didn't create the scarce resource. The land itself was already there, we just decided to use it for a church, or a mosque, or a synagogue, or something along those lines. In the same way, we could have used it to build a store, or a hospital, or just a house so someone could live in it. Religion did not create the scarce resource, it simply used the scarce resource to build a religious building. But at least it is a scarce resource that someone might fight over. In contrast, though, it doesn't really seem to be a scarce resource created by religion. And the other 3 ways to which religion was supposed to create scarce resources, it simply doesn't create scarce resources in any sane understanding of what the term means. For example, he claimed that that religion creates scarce resources through inscripturation, which basically means privileging one holy book over other books. But privileging something isn't the same as scarcity. I know the idea is that, for instance, as a Christian, I can walk over here, grab a Bible, and say, this Bible in my hand is more important than all the other books that I have sitting over there that you can't see, but which are over there, because this Bible was actually on a stack of books. It is the Word of God. It is special. It is more important to me than any of the others. It is more valuable than the others. Great. The other books still exist, though. And generally speaking, Christians allow you to read other books besides just the Bible. Privileging this book over the other books is not the same thing as making the books scarce. What's more, the Bible is not itself a scarce resource, even in the conventional way of understanding it. Conventionally, a scarce resource would be something that only exists in a limited quantity. For example, land we just talked about. There's only so much land on Earth, therefore we use land to live on and to do other things that we do in our lives. And if I use the land for one purpose, it may therefore not be suitable for another. For example, if I build a church on land, you can't grow crops there because the building is on top of the land that you would need to plant the actual crop in. You cannot grow crops underneath a building typically, unless it's something like a mushroom crop or a moss crop or some sort of crop from a plant that would not need much sunlight. And you certainly aren't going to get much use as farmland if a church is directly on top of the land. Now, you could, of course, build a garden or even a farm next to a church by having fields there, but I'm talking about the land the church is on. That makes it a scarce resource simply because of the fact that there is a limited amount of land to do things on. But when it comes to the Bible, what makes it a scarce resource, according to Avalos, is purely that it is privileged above other books, even though that in no way makes the other books less plentiful, nor does it make the Bible in any way less plentiful. He conflates favoring one book or giving it a special position over other things with scarcity, and that's not what scarcity actually means. Scarcity means there is a limited quantity of something. It does not mean that you have one thing that you value more than another. But what's more, I can guarantee you that the Bible is not a scarce resource because the very Christians who think of the Bible as the Word of God and favor it will give you free Bibles. No joke, you can easily get a Bible. You can go, there are plenty of ministries that will give you free Bibles. Bibles are handed out all the time on street corners, or bookstores, or churches, or other various venues. There are 800 numbers you can call and they will send you free Bibles. Bibles are available. If you really want one, you can acquire one. What's more, if you don't want a free one, which are admittedly usually of lower quality, simply so the church can mass produce them, because churches also have limited funding, despite being presented as always being fabulously wealthy megachurches in modern atheist propaganda. But you can easily get a Bible, and the same thing happens with other religions. If I wanted a Quran for free, I could get one very easily. Muslims will give them to me. And if I want a higher quality one, I can purchase one off of Amazon. I can purchase one through Barnes & Noble. I can go to Books A Million. I can go to several bookstores, or even regular stores like Dollar Tree, or Walmart, or Target. They all sell Bibles. In fact, I have only been once to a Dollar Tree where it didn't have Bibles, and that's because they were sold out of them, not because they don't carry them. I could purchase a Bible or get one for free. They are not scarce in any sane calibration. The same thing is true of the Quran or the Book of Mormon. Now, Jewish Bibles are a little bit different because Jews don't typically try and convert people. You can convert to Judaism, but it is not a religious belief that actively proselytizes, as we say today. At the same time, though, I don't know of any Jew who is trying to hide Jewish Bibles from people, or hide the Talmud, or hide other Jewish works. I can easily go to a bookstore and purchase a Jewish Bible. The simple reality is, even when the religion isn't trying to win converts, they don't typically hide their scripture. I know some of you will now bring up mystery religions, but Hector Avalos specified the Bible and the Quran, and they are not scarce resources, because they are freely available. To be a scarce resource in Marxist theory means that it has to be something of limited quantity that the group wants to keep access and control of for itself. This is what causes the conflict. For example, let's look at the land that we talked about earlier. If me and my tribe live in an area, we may want to keep all the land in that area for our own use. And while we may choose to build a church or a grain storage or a hospital or a house or whatever on a given plot of land, which we'll have to do eventually, we need to build things to use, and we'll probably have to put all of those in somewhere. The fact is that our tribe is using this land, and your tribe can't come in and take our land from us. That's why it's silly to think about inscripturation as a scarce resource. Because when it comes to resource scarcity that causes conflict, if one tribe wants the land that my tribe is on, there might be a war as that tribe invades our land to take our land from us to use it for themselves. But no one's going to do that over a Bible because, again, I can simply give you a free Bible. We want you to have Bibles. Muslims want you to have copies of the Quran, this is not the same thing. But then again, it also doesn't make sense because Hector Avalos was himself a secular humanist, and secular humanists value the Humanist Manifestos and various humanist works over the Bible or the Quran or other works. Hector Avalos himself actually favors certain books, but because he's an atheist and therefore not religious, it doesn't count as inscripturation, because that's a religious term. And there really is no difference. Not in actuality. Of course, Avalos also had some other bizarre ideas. One of the other ways in which religion created scarce resources was by group privilege, that you privilege members of your group over others. Avalos had this odd tendency to equate privilege with scarcity. However, privilege is not the same thing as scarcity, and regardless of whether you think privilege is good or not, it is irrelevant because privilege is not scarcity. What's more, since his primary attack was on Christianity, and to some degree Islam, it makes absolutely no sense. After all, Muslims don't actually privilege Muslims in the way that would create violence, not in the way that the scarce resource theory is being presented. Because after all, Muslims want me and you and everyone listening, unless you already are a Muslim, to become a Muslim. I could join Islam at any time and be a Muslim. That means that it isn't really a scarce resource to be a Muslim. It may be true that certain Muslims value Muslims over other groups, the outsiders. They may privilege their group. But if I can just join that group and gain the same privileges by joining the group, and if they are perfectly welcoming of me joining their group, then it is irrelevant that they privilege their group over others. It is not a scarce resource. It is not something they're hoarding and protecting to stop other people from taking it from them. It's not like Muslims are saying, oh, we have to be careful how many new Muslims we allow in. If we allow too many in, it'll disperse our Muslimness everywhere. We have to hoard our Muslimness. We have to fight to defend our Muslimness. That's nonsense. It's idiotic. That is not how Islam works, and it's not really how Christianity works either. Christianity is a universalist religion. Christianity welcomes people to join it. Christianity's group privilege of other Christians in no way actually creates a scarcity of resources. But what's even more bizarre is that Avalos doesn't seem to realize that this is exactly the sort of thing he does, because after all, he's an atheist. He has no religion. Therefore, it can't apply to him. It only applies to religion. But Avalos very clearly favored atheists over religious people in his writing, and I am using his terminology. Avalos saw himself as the fifth horseman of the new atheism. He wanted to begin the second wave of the new atheism. He very obviously favored new atheists over regular atheists and all atheists over religious people. So, even though he likes to claim that religion is creating this group privilege, and that we would be better off without religion, he himself created this privilege. Of course, in reality, the new atheism was a religion. No, I do not have to explain why atheism is a religion, because I didn't say atheism is a religion. I said the new atheism was a religion. There is a difference between those two statements. I don't care that sociopathic atheists can't tell the difference, or more accurately, will insist I called atheism a religion so they can ridicule me using some 20-year-old garbage that Sam Harris said. Because, let's face it, atheists are not typically honest these days. If they were, they would not equate privilege with scarcity. Which brings me to the final way Hector Avalos said religion creates scarcity, and that way is by salvation. According to Hector Avalos's retelling of Marxist ideals, religion also creates scarce resources by salvation, because only members of that religion are saved and give you the path to salvation. But in addition to assuming all religions offer salvation, which is simply not true, because most actually don't. In fact, of the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism doesn't actually have a concept of salvation in the same way Christianity and Islam do, and even Islam isn't truly focused on salvation the way Christianity is. It's obviously just thinking of Christianity, but Buddhism, Hinduism, Shinto, they're not really focused on salvation, but it doesn't really matter, according to Avalos. The religious concept of salvation is a scarce resource created by religion, and it really isn't, because Christians teach that everyone can be saved. Seriously, have you ever seen Christians trying to hoard salvation for their tribal affiliation? Do you honestly think Christians are saying, we have to protect our salvation and access to it? No outsiders! We have to keep the non-Christians from getting our salvation! Are Christians actually fighting to prevent other people from gaining salvation? That's antithetical to what Christians actually do. They try and win converts so everyone can have salvation. Salvation is not a scarce resource in Christianity by any sane metric. That is why Avalos has to use the privilege argument, but again, privilege isn't the same thing as scarcity, so his argument makes no sense. Then again, this is the same bloke who obviously had problems with his own Christian upbringing that he wanted to constantly attack. He had been a Pentecostal, he had also been a boy preacher, and he wanted to repudiate the very superficial theological stances he obviously experienced out on the revival tours. But at the same time, he very obviously never studied theology, and he didn't understand it. I can prove that by one famous example that people point to, and that would be R.A. Torrey. He was the chief editor of the book The Fundamentals, from whence we get the name Fundamentalists. Because according to Hector Avalos, he tried to depict Torrey as a monster. And he did so in the way that the modern new atheists always do, by pretending that he is making a logical, rational point when he is actually appealing to emotions, and at the same time he completely botched what was actually believed by R.A. Torrey, and got the beliefs that Torrey advanced wrong. Of course, R.A. Torrey was writing in the late 19th and early 20th century, which is problematic because if I try and explain how Hector Avalos got Torrey's views wrong, I'm usually greeted with the same defense mechanism the holy religion of atheism tends to use when people criticize its ideas. The dreaded, "Oh, so that makes it okay!" retort. I really hate when I'm trying to have a historical conversation about what people used to think in the past and why a certain specific atheist argument is wrong, being treated as if I am wholeheartedly endorsing the view of what I am saying. I've had this happen several times, especially when it comes to the views of Funny Mustache Man, who ruled a Central European power who the two of you won't let me name. But you have to understand, when I'm trying to get people to understand history and theology and what people really believed, it doesn't mean I agree with what they're saying or disagree with it. It just means that I'm explaining it. With that said, I'm still probably going to get the, "Oh, so that makes it okay" retort. Well, the point I'm making is that Hector Avalos was not a brilliant scholar presenting an accurate, well-reasoned argument. He was a new atheist writing polemic, and using the idea that atheists aren't religious and that atheists are rational, to get away with what is ultimately shoddy work, because people give atheists more of a pass and scrutinize their work less, and in fact, the atheist movement has made academia obviously worse, because it has dragged everything down to a much more simplistic way of thinking. The modern academic world is in shambles, and it is largely because of the movements that gave rise to the new atheism and in part the new atheism itself. The new atheism itself is, of course, nothing more than an extension of the progressive values that were attempting to reassert themselves. It was just an attempt to counter the religious right, and it was largely created to promote political agendas. While throwing up the mere lack of belief in a God, we don't have shared belief smokescreen to prevent anyone from being able to criticize it. But in this case, it's very obvious that Hector Avalos is making a specific comment about history and about theology that is completely incorrect. But note, I'm not saying, it makes it okay! What I'm saying is that R.A. Torrey's actual views differed from what Hector Avalos claimed they were. Now, Hector Avalos wanted to basically take a swipe out of the concept of the age of accountability and salvation, because that's what I suppose he was preaching when he was a small child, which people could then be happily impressed and clapped on, which he then walked away from. He simply wanted to attack everything that he heard in his Pentecostal church with nothing but a superficial understanding of it or the history of Christian beliefs. R.A. Torrey was, of course, a Baptist, not a Pentecostal. He did tend to lean more toward Pentecostalism in his later life when it got started at the Azusa Street Revival, but what Avalos said is still not what Hector Avalos claimed he said. But to qualify it, I do not believe in eugenics. I do not believe in the eugenics theories of bad parents giving birth to bad children, and it wouldn't matter where they were raised. It would just matter this defect of genes. I don't believe that. So I'm not saying what R.A. Torrey said in the fundamentals or in his later works. In this case, it would be a textbook he wrote for the Moody Bible Institute, is something I agree with, or it makes it okay. So when atheists inevitably resort to the, oh, so that makes it okay nonsense, keep in mind my actual point is that Hector Avalos lied about what R.A. Torrey actually said. And I'm calling it a lie because even if Hector Avalos believed what he was saying was accurate, he was a scholar. He was a Bible scholar. This is the authority to which atheists always held him up. And simply put, he should have known better, should have done better research, and even if he believed what he was saying was true, he's still lying by telling you, I know this as a Bible scholar, when he very obviously didn't. He should have done better research. This is not a scholarly opinion. It is a polemic. Having said that, Hector Avalos claimed that, and he used polemic language. He called the conquest of Canaan the Canaanite genocide, so that we can vilify Israel and vilify God, who ordered genocide in the Bible. And he claimed that R.A. Torrey thought the Canaanite genocide of children was okay, because, according to R.A. Torrey, and I quote, the extermination of the Canaanite children was not only an act of mercy and love to the world at large, it was an act of love and mercy to the children themselves. End quote. That's the only part that Avalos quoted, at least in this source I'm using. I'm not going to the full book, just an article. But after that, it says this. Torrey's rationale was that if those children had been allowed to grow up, they would probably have suffered eternity in hell, but having been slaughtered as infants, they would go to heaven. The problem with this is, that is not what Torrey believed. You see, R.A. Torrey actually believed that Jesus was the way you go to heaven, and that the way to heaven was not open to man until Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. that means no one went to heaven prior to the resurrection. That would include the Canaanite children who had died over 1,000 years before the time of Christ. R.A. Torrey did not truly believe that killing the Canaanite children was a blessing because killing them as infants sent them directly to heaven, whereas they would suffer an eternity in hell had they grown up and sinned. Rather, R.A. Torrey believed the, ironically, scientific view at the time that some people are dysgenic. You see, contrary to the way R.A. Torrey is presented, since he was one of the founders of the fundamentalist movement, he was not anti-science. Of course, saying what I'm about to say now, you can say, yes, he was eugenics, that was pseudoscience. Unfortunately, the pseudoscience of eugenics was science of the day. And, quite contrary to modern atheist polemic, it really isn't true that the Christian church supported eugenics. Of course, it's all one big church when they need to vilify it. The Catholic Church opposed eugenics. So did the Church of England, and so did many different Protestant groups. But you have to understand, R.A. Torrey, even though he was one of the founders of the fundamentals, and we think of the fundamentalists as anti-science, anti-reason, and as rejecting things like evolution, actually supported evolutionary theory. It was called Darwinism in the day, but he fully supported Darwinism. He fully supported other scientific discoveries, and he often interpreted biblical works through the lens of holistic understanding of the world, which included the modern science of the day. The reason that is important to note is because R.A. Torrey rejected the conservative ideas of the more conservative churches that eugenics was wrong, and instead embraced at least some aspects of eugenics. He did not embrace eugenics totally. And he did believe that the regenerative power of Christ could overcome dysgenic origins. But he still believed that there was such a thing as dysgenic origins. R.A. Torrey's actual argument was that the Canaanites were simply biologically degenerated and incapable of being moral, and were being eradicated in order to stop the spread of their particular form of corruption, because while all humanity was corrupt in R.A. Torrey's view, this corruption would have been innate. I don't think they knew about genetics at the time, but in effect, it would be something that is heritable. And the Canaanites had gone too far down the degeneracy lane and could not be reasoned with or talked out of their immoral lifestyles. It was simply the way they were. R.A. Torrey's actual views were actually in line with the eugenics thinking of the day, and ultimately his argument was that it was an act of love and mercy to kill the children in infancy because it prevented the spread on Earth, while still alive, of the dysgenic traits that they possessed, both in that it would stop them from harming other people because of their natural inclinations, and stop them from procreating, producing further dysgenic individuals. It would also stop them from harming themselves because dysgenic people of that sort often did things that harmed themselves because of this natural imbalance, and that is how R.A. Torrey was understanding it. This is why he thought Israel, not the Jews, because Israel was actually 12 tribes, not just one, and there were not 12 Jewish tribes. Jews come from the tribe of Judah. But he did think that Israel was being selectively bred to become a better sort of human. He was interpreting it through a eugenics lens, and again, that is precisely the point. The reason he was okay with the, as Abelos put it, Canaanite genocide, was not because he thought the infants would go to heaven after they died, but rather because they had not reached the age of accountability. He wasn't arguing that had they been allowed to reach adulthood, they would have started sinning and then gone to an eternity in hell. His argument was about the dysgenic nature of their biological magical existence. After all, R.A. Torrey actually believed people that were born before Jesus' resurrection, and it is the resurrection that gives us the hope of new life, not simply his death. But R.A. Torrey believed that people that were born prior to the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus could still be saved. There is a part in the Bible where it mentions that Jesus preached to the souls of the damned. The infamous harrowing of hell. Specifically, this is in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 19. It talks about Jesus preaching to the souls in prison. It was the actual belief of R.A. Torrey that prior to the time of Christ, when you died, you went to a spiritual prison. You did not go straight to hell. You still don't go straight to hell. You actually go to this unpleasant waiting room, I suppose you could say. People are not going to go to hell or be cast into the lake of fire until final judgment. Until then, they would go to this other place. This place is alluded to in a parable of Jesus as well, the rich man and Lazarus, whereas Lazarus is in paradise, and the rich man is separated by a gulf between Lazarus and the rich man. There's this gulf, and the rich man is in a sort of perdition, but it is not yet hell. So, in R.A. Torrey's view, all those who died prior to the resurrection of Christ could still have been saved by Jesus when he went to preach to the souls in prison, if they accepted him, and some did and some didn't. But R.A. Torrey did not believe that infants who had yet to reach the age of accountability were allowed to be killed in Canaan because they went straight to heaven, because they didn't. No one entered heaven at all from humans prior to the resurrection. Even babies, when they died, were not allowed into heaven under this view. And I don't really say this because I think it makes it okay, even though that is how atheists typically defend these arguments. But at the same time, R.A. Torrey's views were actually shaped by the science of the day, not just biblical theology and believing in fairy tales. And it was utterly dishonest for Hector Avalos, atheist Bible scholar extraordinaire, to present R.A. Torrey as talking about the age of accountability, making it okay to kill Canaanite children, when that was not his actual argument. Whether or not you still find R.A. Torrey's argument repugnant, which of course as atheists who hate Christianity you will anyway, because nothing Christians say will ever be good enough for you regardless, you're still going to in fact blame me by saying I believe the same things R.A. Torrey does and talk about how awful I am and do the "oh, so that makes it okay" routine somehow on me. But the fact is, Hector Avalos still lied about the rationale of R.A. Torrey, and that is not the only mistake that Hector Avalos made. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because, let's face reality, Hector Avalos was a Marxist. This fact was not highly advertised, but it's obvious from his writings, since he's using the scarce resource model for his religious violence, and if you read his works, it's obvious he has this through line of oppressor and oppressed. And Marxism, as a belief system, is inherently atheistic. Atheism itself is a belief that there is no God. Atheism is not a lack of belief in a God. And like theism, no one is ever just an atheist. In the modern world, atheists tend to be left-wing politically. They like to say that since atheism is not an ideology and not a religion, that means that atheists can be all over the place. That means that they are all over the place, because they like doing the word games. But if you think about the actual facts you see in the world and not just how the word atheism is defined and extrapolating from that definition what you would expect to see and pretending these expectations are reality, you would realize that based upon any statistics you can look at, ranging from the United States Census Department to surveys by the Home Office in Britain to Pew studies, it repeatedly shows that the overwhelming majority of atheists are actually left-wing politically. And they are generally tied to progressive values. This is why you see a disproportionate number of atheists also being socialist, even in the United States, where socialism is not particularly popular. And when you really look at Abelous's work, or for that matter, the work of any of the other modern popular atheists, you see the same progressive lines, and you see, for the most part, a resurrection of 19th century free thought and rationalist press association works. Their arguments are basically derived from them. They are part of an ideology. They do not just lack belief in a God together. They run various tax-exempt atheist organizations that have very clearly stated political goals. But rather like talking about the Freedom from Religion Foundation being an anti-Christian hate group, for some bizarre reason, atheists keep challenging me on this, even though it's a self-evident fact. By the way, it's a self-evident fact that the Freedom from Religion Foundation is an anti-Christian hate group. Telling me that it's not an anti-Christian hate group, telling me that they only exist to preserve the constitutional principles of separation of church and state and equality for all, that the religious people are trying to destroy to create a theocracy and a real-life Handmaid's Tale and Christian Sharia law, just like Iran and Saudi Arabia, but under Christian Sharia law. Telling me all that means nothing, when if you go to their website and go to their store, you will see warning stickers that you can put on Bibles in hotels that tell you that believing in this fictional book is dangerous and bad for your health. You can find the non-tracts where they bash Christianity and Christian beliefs by saying it's bad for women, the Ten Commandments are awful, Jesus was immoral, and yada yada yada. And if you read the articles on the Freedom from Religion site, they are very, very, very obviously anti-Christian. They are talking about things like how awful it is that preachers preach sermons at funerals, or how religious trauma is created by children being forced to go to church and learn about hell and all that other things. They have very obvious anti-Christian bent. And they're free thought heroes who fought religion. They do not exist just to support the separation of church and state. They obviously exist to spread hatred for Christians. And they're a 501c3 tax-exempt atheist organization that gets involved in politics in clear violation of the Johnson Amendment. But that's the point. We have a group of modern atheists who are clearly progressives politically and obviously taking their ideas from Marxism, telling us they are not Marxists and that they don't have any political agenda, they just lack belief in a God. And this isn't just the Freedom from Religion Foundation. American Atheist was founded by someone who was an outright communist, and it's not like she just happened to be a communist and an atheist. She actually founded the American Atheist Organization, Madalyn Murray O'Hair did, specifically to promote Marxism in America. It was actually funded, in part, by the Soviet Union and by the Communist Party USA, which it had strong ties to. And when you look at the American Humanist Association, it defended the Soviet Union and also took money from the American Communist Party and from the Soviets themselves. So it really isn't true that these groups have no ideological connection or no ideological bias, and as much as someone might say, well, that was the past, things change, they really haven't. They still press the same progressive values, the same progressive politics. They still have the same overall agenda. And considering that the American Humanist Association, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and American Atheists and other groups like them either directly supported the Soviets or grew out of organizations that directly supported the Soviets, and are still making arguments made by people who supported the Soviets, like Joseph McCabe did in the early 20th century, where he literally defended the Soviet Union, talking about how much worse Christians were historically. Or like H.G. Wells, who openly praised the intellect of Vladimir Lenin and all. I mean, it's obvious. I mean, think about it. Joseph McCabe, who wrote in his biographical dictionary of free thinkers, either that or the biographical encyclopedia, it's just a revision of the same work, that Joseph Stalin was one of the greatest living statesmen in Europe. Keep in mind, this was written in either the 1930s or 1940s, depending on if it's the dictionary or encyclopedia. He had glowing things to say about Lenin in both of those works. He had glowing things to say about Marx in both of those works. And in those works, he blamed the church with being the greatest obstacle for eugenics and eugenics reform, which he also supported, because of course he did. The atheist movement was very heavily involved in supporting eugenics, rather than the modern myth where the atheist realized that it was pseudoscience and opposed it, while the Christian church supported it. But therein lies the point. It's fairly obvious that modern-day atheists hold to a specific humanist ideology and a humanist belief system, and it is very obvious that they have promoted violence and justified violence through their works. And yet they keep saying, religion is violent. If we had an atheist world, it would be more peaceful. And there's no reason to believe that. For one thing, no one is ever just an atheist, even playing along with the silly atheism is just a lack of belief in a god nonsense. You have to notice that people group themselves together based upon ideological belief systems that they share in common. Atheists themselves contradict their claim that they have nothing in common with other atheists but their lack of belief in a god, as soon as they tell you they hang out with other atheists and listen to atheist YouTube channels and read atheist blogs and books because they like being around like-minded individuals. In fact, the mere fact that they listen to atheist YouTube channels or read atheist blogs or read atheist websites or read atheist books or even go to atheist conventions like Skepticon proves that in their mind there is a shared belief system, a shared identity about being an atheist. For example, the friendly to pedophiles atheist Hamet Mehta, who, by the way, protected a PDF file named Ray Moorhead, he did a video about a decade ago now that claimed that atheists cannot be Republicans and cannot vote Republican. That makes him very obviously politically partisan. But at the same time, he linked his political partisanship specifically to atheism. And you see this recurring if you go to atheist websites. It's becoming less true that they have to all be Democrats, but you will see that the reason for this is not because some of them are actually drifting rightward so much as the right wing is basically just the Republican Party, and it is gradually accepting what Democrats used to around 10 to 20 years ago. There are, of course, some atheists drifting more rightward in their views, at least how Americans define rightward, speaking from the American political system. For the most part, it's more because the Overton window has changed, rather than the actual positions that were being pushed in the ether. But having said all of that, if you were to go to any atheist site, it's very obvious that they inform you on how atheists can be moral, or how atheists can build moral codes based on nature and don't need God, which means that they inherently have an aspect of religion, since morality is an aspect of religion. I did not just say, you need religion before you can be moral, that morals must come from religion. I said morals are an aspect of religion. There's a difference. But it's a difference that will be ignored, just like the difference between me saying secular humanism and other atheist ideals are a religion will be ignored, and all the atheists will hear is me saying atheism is a religion, because they're stupid and they have this pre-scripted way of dismissing that. But having said that, you can look on atheist sites, and they very, 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 very clearly promote progressive political views. They are left-wing, and they promote secular humanism, humanist values, and tell you how to find meaning in a world without religion. And to deny this and fall back on the atheism is, by definition, just a lack of belief in a god, or to tell me that not all atheists agree with this is meaningless, because I don't actually think all atheists believe this. I think all modern-day militant atheists do, because they're all part of the same movement. And it's not an all-or-nothing thing where I have to accept all atheists are unique individuals who lack belief in a god, or else all atheists have exactly the same beliefs. It's obvious that the modern atheist movement, however, does have shared beliefs in common. It is also obvious that they will not bring the world peace and unity, because they have constant infighting. For example, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the 501c3 tax-exempt atheist organization, had a bequest given to it by a wealthy donor, something that they don't like talking about because they like pretending to be these scrappy underdogs, when in fact they are backed by wealthy people. But not as many, because some are dying off, and some went to prison, and some went to prison and died by suicide. Here's looking at you, Jack Epstein. But at the last minute, the elderly atheist who had been donating to the Freedom from Religion Foundation and promised them the bequest after he got his own children's bequest, also changed his will and gave a bequest to American atheists as well. And the Freedom from Religion Foundation proved Christopher Hitchens was right. When atheists have disagreements, they sit down and talk like civilized adults and work out their differences without conflict. Religion makes everything about divine command and God's will. Religious people are thus utterly entrenched in their views and refuse to listen to others or compromise. For theirs is the will of God and everyone else is heathens. That's why religion fights. But atheists really proved their compassion and empathy here. Because while the Freedom from Religion Foundation and Dan Barker and his wife Ann Nicole Gaylor both thought they should rightly get all the money, they reasoned with their fellow atheists over at American Atheists. Oh, wait, no, they didn't. They sued the hell out of them, because that's what the Freedom from Religion Foundation does. It sues people. They know all the legal tricks. And what was their goal in this lawsuit? Well, to get all the money, of course. Because even though we all know religion is a scam for money and churches just shrink in tax-free dollars so they can push evil right-wing agendas, and so the pastors who are all secretly atheists and know it's a lie and a con job can live like kings. Atheists, the scrappy underdogs, would never do that with their morality, compassion, and empathy, but they did. Because let's face it, the atheist enterprise was largely motivated by a desire for wealth and power, the desire to reshape society along their ideals, and sought to live lavishly. Granted, they like playing into the, we're the scrappy underdogs talk. You see them dressing largely in plain, normal clothing. You see them, if you see Dan Barker, he usually wears clothes that look like they came out of a thrift store. These are the poor atheists. They're the scrappy underdogs against the wealthy church. But in reality, Dan Barker is a millionaire, and he got that way by being an atheist activist. Because even though there's no such thing as a professional atheist, as no one will pay you to passively lack belief in a god, you can make a pretty good living not making money as a professional atheist, with no one paying you to passively lack belief in a god. But it wasn't enough money for Dan Barker and his wife. He wanted more, and all of a sudden conflict emerges. Now, you may say this is not really proof of anything, since when religion causes violence, it's definitely the religion and its dogma that causes violence, whereas atheism is just a lack of belief. But this has always been disingenuous, because for one thing, when atheists talk about religion-inspired violence, they talk about things that were not actually motivated by theological beliefs. For example, I have actually heard the Wounded Knee Massacre being blamed on Christianity. Why? because the people who enacted it, as well as the government that ordered it, was generally populated by Christians. This, of course, was the United States of America's government, which is officially secular, but that's irrelevant. What's relevant is the actual people were Christians. Therefore, every action they did was motivated by their religion, and the Wounded Knee Massacre was a religious slaughter in the name of Christianity. It's obvious that their religion caused it. Meanwhile, when the state atheist Soviet Union sets up an organization called the League of Militant Atheists and actively starts targeting priests and executing them, well, it had nothing to do with their mere lack of belief in a god. Gosh, golly, gosham shucks, atheism had no motivating power on that. But ultimately, it doesn't matter anyway, since the atheist movement keeps bashing Christians simply if they are Christians, by saying, even if we accept that your religion didn't motivate you to do this bad thing, your religion didn't stop you from doing it either, proving how worthless it is, unlike us atheists. Or worse, your religion says all you can do any bad thing you want and still go to heaven. All you have to do is do the bad thing and then say, I shall be Jesus, and you're saved. Whereas we atheists have to take accountability. We can't have Magic Sky Daddy forgive us no matter what we do. Aaron Ra himself said it. If I loved sin, I'd be a Christian. But because I'm so moral, I'm an atheist, I have to be accountable for my actions. Atheists know that this is the only life we get, even though they merely lack belief in a God rather than believing there is no God. Even though they don't believe there is no afterlife, they just lack belief. They know we only have this life, and when we die, it's over. Because even though that would require knowing God doesn't exist and knowing there's no afterlife, that's not something they believe. That's something they lack belief in. And keep in mind, though, that is the argument. Atheists are moral because they know this is our only life. Whereas Christians are not moral because they know that they can do anything they want. Cheat on their wives, rape women, murder, doesn't matter. Because once they do the bad thing, they still go to heaven by saying, I shall be Jesus. And that's all there is to it. Religion is an excuse for immorality. That's why religious people are less moral. Atheists are moral because they know this is the only life we get. Well, that's not really true, because while there are Christians who do immoral actions, there is absolutely no evidence that this is done on a particularly large industrial scale, and let's face reality, I have never, ever seen a particularly moral atheist. And this particular I want all the money move done by the Freedom from Religion Foundation against the American atheists actually illustrates that point quite well, because let's face it, they did not just sit down at a table and reasonably talk about their differences and come to a rational conclusion. The Freedom from Religion Foundation did this to all of its enemies and simply sued them because the Freedom from Religion Foundation is not friends with American atheists. They simply had a common enemy of Christians. But let's face it, we're dealing with a lot of money. They want all of it, and they want to take it. Ironically, I am actually on the side of American atheists in this debate because it really does look like the Freedom from Religion Foundation is just motivated by greed, and the man had every right to bequest the money to anyone he wished to, and if he wished to do so to American atheists, he should have been allowed to. I don't say that because I like American atheists more than the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I actually find both of them equally contemptible and awful groups that exist to promote anti-Christian hate and to force their own religion down people's throats while telling us with a smile on their face, we don't have a religion, we merely lack belief in a God. How can a lack of belief be a religion? And while telling us who we're allowed to vote for, what politics to stand for, and overall interfering with elections whilst saying, tax the church! The church is breaking the law! The Johnson Amendment! The separation of church and state is being threatened! First Amendment! We atheists believe in freedom! We atheists are law-abiding! Tax the church! I mean, after all, Aaron Ra, former president of American Atheists and member in good standing of American Atheists, even went on record to tell us, in no uncertain terms, that the only reason religion is tax-exempt is because it agreed not to get into politics. That's the price it pays for its tax exemption. It must remain silent on politics. The fact that churches are involved in politics is a clear violation of the First Amendment and what America's founders wanted, and churches should be stripped of their tax exemption if they want to get involved in politics. And since they are involved in politics, they should be legally stripped of their tax exemption. And yet, American Atheists is a tax-exempt organization that gets involved in politics all the time. And I suppose the excuse is they're not religious, therefore the rules don't count. But keep in mind, the rules don't say religious bodies aren't allowed to engage in politics. The tax codes actually say any 501c3 can't. So even if I accepted that American Atheists, Freedom from Religion Foundation, Recovering from Religion, Secular Student Alliance, and the others that very clearly get involved in politics are not religious, they would still have to be kept out of politics. Because the actual tax code doesn't say the price of religion staying out of being not taxed is that it stays out. It's anyone. Besides, they all promote secular humanism, which is a religion legally classified by law. And I don't care if you agree that secular humanism is a religion or not. We're talking about law, and the law has already determined that it is. The reality is, nonetheless, that the atheist movement is not really made up of friends who want to build a better world based upon a positive ideology. It is based on allies who have a common enemy. In other words, they're guilty of the very thing they blame Christians on: tribalism and hatred of outsiders and outgroup bias. The fact that people are Christian are seen as evil. In fact, Christians are pure evil. Christians are the enemy. We must destroy Christians. And I really don't see how people who go about saying that are fundamentally different than the communists who believed exactly the same thing, and I don't see the end result being particularly better. After all, the Soviet Union never officially banned religion. It just prevented you from ever working in any government job, which happened to be 75% of the jobs in the Soviet Union after the communist takeover. If you held religious beliefs, you had to be an atheist to work any government job, and that included jobs like trash man, because they were all run by the government. They forbade you to go to university. If you were religious, you had to be an atheist to go to university. And while atheist propaganda was freely disseminated everywhere, religious propaganda was, at various times, either restricted to certain free speech zones, restricted to within a house or a church, or banned, not allowed to be used at all. The Soviet Union even agreed with the modern atheist dictum that raising a child in religion is child abuse, and enacted laws that said you could not teach anyone any religious principle prior to the age of 16. And we all know this wonderful, loving group of the Soviet Union is nothing like modern-day atheists. I mean, they were tyrannical. They actually ran their country on religion, not like the modern people. But keep in mind, American Atheists, Freedom from Religion Foundation, Secular Student Alliance, the Center for Inquiry, the American Humanist Association, Humanist International, and various other atheist groups, they've all said raising children in religion is child abuse. They've all said that only legal adults should be allowed to be taught, depending upon what country they're from, either 16 or 18 or so, should be allowed, and it should be illegal to teach children religion under that. They talk about how religion is like genitals, except not everyone has them, since atheists have no religion. They endlessly do the same thing. Am I really supposed to think the very people saying that, if they gained enough political power, would not make a law that says you cannot take your children to church or teach them religion until they're 18? And if they did that, how would that be any different than the Soviet Union? They already have in some countries free speech zones where you're limited, where you can't speak at least certain things because they're offensive to public, including street preaching. There have been arrests of street preachers in the United Kingdom. There have been arrests of people who silently pray outside of abortion clinics in the United Kingdom. There have been arrests of a woman silently praying outside of a closed abortion clinic in the UK. Ostentatiously because they don't want people's feelings hurt who are going in to get an abortion. Am I supposed to really understand this as non-religious and secular and tolerant? Am I honestly supposed to look at the modern society where this is happening and think Christians are not at all being mistreated, and if I say they are, it's because of my Christian persecution complex? 85 churches were burned down in Canada in the wake of the news story of a supposed mass graves being discovered within residential schools, and talks about how the Christians committed genocide against the natives. And yet they never actually found the mass graves. Just indentions in the ground where people had pipes or trees or the like. The simple truth is, the modern atheist movement is indistinguishable from the Soviet Union or from communist China. They believe exactly the same things. They are all materialists. They all have the same humanist values. And by the way, even though Matt Dillahunty said no country has ever been based on humanism, that was a lie. The Soviet Union was. Just read Erich Fromm on the Marxist Archive online. You can find his works easily. The simple truth is, humanism was the basis of Soviet thought. It was the basis of modern-day Chinese thought. They're all secular humanist governments. And that begs the question, why should I think religion is particularly violent and secularism is not, when the most violent century in human history was the 20th century? Now, some try and write that off by saying the technology is the reason it's different, but it's not, at least not totally. Oh, don't get me wrong, I do agree that our ability to travel and our ability to mete out death to a larger scale contributes to that. But to say that that is the only reason is silly. When you look at the Middle Ages, often referred to as the Dark Ages, you don't just find that they limited violence because of a lack of technology. They would limit violence on principle. They held to certain chivalric codes and codes of honor, which, while not quite as grandiose as our romantic views of them sometimes are, were still nevertheless obvious restrictions on violence. For example, you could not fight on Sundays in Europe. You had to hold people ransom. It was really only the nobles and the kings and volunteers in the army that fought. The normal person was not subject to military conscription or military service of any kind. And it's not like today where our leaders sat safely in their capitals, sending other people to die for them. They would fight the wars themselves. The wars were generally smaller scale and were generally more civilized in how they were conducted. And by smaller scale, I don't just mean smaller scale in terms of what they are today. They were also smaller than the previous centuries of the Roman Empire under paganism, or centuries where Christianity did not exist. The simple truth of the matter is, both Christianity and Islam, surprisingly, actually brought a pacifying effect that reduced the overall amount of wars. Not down to zero, but it did reduce the number of wars fought, and it changed the way wars were fought into more civil affairs than they had been previously. And even the most violent of the Islamic regimes, like the Barbaries, tended to be less violent than we tend to give them credit for. They were definitely violent, but the violence is overstated. Whereas when we look at officially atheist China and its organ harvesting, or the officially atheist Soviet Union and how it would arrest people for thought crimes, or the modern United Kingdom, the most secular country in Europe by some counts, arresting people for thought crimes, it becomes obvious that simply saying a secular society is more peaceful and free is ridiculous, and the idea that religion promotes violence just by its nature of being religious is delusional. The simple reality is, the causes for violence, as well as the causes for oppression, it can't be summed up with words like religion. There is always more to it than that. And the word religion is nothing more than, well, a distraction. You see, I'm not arguing that religious societies are less violent just because they're religious. I'm not arguing that secular societies are violent because they're secular. I'm arguing that there really is no distinction between a religious society and a secular society, and people fight for all sorts of reasons, and that modern secularism is more dangerous precisely because of this mythology that religion is what needs to be safeguarded against, and our idea of turning everything over to a secular state, which will inevitably begin to want to promote a secular ideology with a clear conscience, since it's not forcing anyone to be religious, and it's only wrong to force religion down people's throats. Secularism isn't religion, it's the opposite of religion. It's neutrality. And ultimately, we delude ourselves into thinking that secularism can't be tyrannical, that secularism must, by definition, be free. We do the same thing with democracy, because even though it's obvious that people are living very isolated, atomized lives with a growing number of the population giving into anxieties and fears and depression and a loneliness epidemic, we still talk about democracy as a net good with no flaws fundamental to it or the society that it produces. But I do think we should look at the moving parts, which brings us back to Guy Fawkes. Why did Guy Fawkes want a Catholic government? Was it just because he believed that we are saved by faith plus works instead of being saved by faith alone? Was he killing people because he thought that there were 73 books of the Bible instead of 66? Or was the reason he wanted to kill people just because he thought bread turned into the flesh and blood of Christ? What were his motives? Well, his motives were more complicated than just those issues. The actual motives for Guy Fawkes and his attempt to blow up Parliament included the social alignment of England to Europe. Because England was now enemies of France and Spain and the Italian city-states, because Italy wasn't a single country at the time, but was more aligned with Germany and Sweden. On top of that, you had various social changes that were brought in with Protestantism. For example, an issue that we generally think of as two differing but utterly secular and non-religious views that wouldn't have come up if they were fighting a religious war was another principal cause for this. The Catholic Church tended to believe in the rule of subsidy, which allowed most laws to be made at a purely regional level, whereas the Protestants in England, not necessarily everywhere, tended to support a centralization of power under the Crown and in Parliament. This explains why he didn't just want to kill the king, but also Parliament. That, and of course, if the country is constitutionally Protestant, just killing the king wouldn't necessarily change that. They would just pick another Protestant monarch. But after Henry VIII destroyed the monasteries and became supreme governor of the church in England, which of course is now the Church of England, it set the precedent for a centralization of power under the monarch and later under the monarch and parliament, which didn't exist during the previous Catholic rule, because the Catholic diocesan model was what was basically copied in English law, and while it didn't always overlap perfectly, in general, the way the Catholic Church works is that local bishops within their diocese have basically the final authority on all matters except for the most important ones binding to the universal faith. And that is how England largely operated as well. Towns and villages were largely independent. They still had to obey certain national laws that were safeguarded by the Parliament and by the king, who was supposed to be the executor of those laws. But for the most part, there was a great deal more independence, whereas after Henry VIII came along, it was a more centralized government. In fact, nationalism emerged at about the same time as the Protestant Reformation, with historians arguing whether nationalism is a product of the Protestant Reformation, or if the Protestant Reformation is a product of nationalism, or if they both emerged based on similar ideas. That's another video. This one's already rather long. However, a lot of people take for granted that we live in nation states now, and don't seem to realize that that's not how the world was understood prior to the 1500s. They had countries, of course, and people still call themselves English or French or the like, but mostly this was referring to your people group, and the land that your people lived on was their land, but it wasn't what primarily defined the group, and ultimately the group was more bound by common language and culture than it was by a centralized legal authority. The kings in the Middle Ages, for instance, had virtually no actual political power, at least not like today's presidents or even the kings in the later era. And the concept of deriving your primary identity from your nation just simply did not exist. But therein lies the point. Because even though, briefly, the Catholic Church returned to England, it didn't exactly overturn all of these new things either. England still largely remained centralized under the Crown and under Parliament under Mary as it did under Henry. And ultimately, the modern Church of England, even though we like simplifying history and saying it was founded by Henry VIII, was actually founded by Queen Elizabeth on compromise, which allowed for greater regional diversity, which would have been closer to what the Catholics had than what even Mary gave them when the Catholic Church was actually restored. However, these are complexities of history that don't change the underlying broad theme, which should still be understood, but also understood that it's not the whole picture, and I don't have time to give the whole picture. This video is already rather long. It is, after all, my November 5th video, so the point I'm trying to make here, and I'll do another video on it later when I don't have as much censorship. Right now, I didn't even write a script for this. I'm simply speaking into a microphone in a comical fashion while saying what I generally want to say, so that I can hopefully avoid the bleep out censorship of the tube of you. But what Guy Fawkes actually believed was not just purely what we would think of as religion, although it did have a say in it. However, even though we think of religion as a personally held belief system about gods and supernatural powers, they thought of it as a communal identity. And again, it did come with certain social changes, like fasting and feast days, what foods you were allowed, what sort of taxes were allowed in your government. Being Catholic or Protestant greatly affected the day-to-day life of people, precisely because no one had at the time even an inkling of our idea of what a religion is supposed to be. We think of religion as an independent belief system. We have this fantasy in which governments can be separated from religion and neutral to it, when they really can't be. After all, we have people like Yuval Noah Harari telling us that you can go and listen to whatever people with funny hats you want and listen to whatever beliefs they are, but they're all fiction, and let's face it, you can still do it. We're not taking away your freedom. You can even live by the principles of your religion until they conflict with secular values. And if your religious views conflict with secular views, you must drop your religious views and live by the secular ones. Oh, you can live by your religious views so long as they conform to a secular standard. There's no reason given for this other than the myth that religion is inherently violent and dangerous and divisive, and that secularism is inherently better. But there's no reason to think that if I were to have values where on one end I hold to religious values, while on the other end secular values contradict it, there is no reason why I should drop my religious values and go with what the secular says. How do we know the secular values are right and the religious ones are wrong, other than the secular ones are secular and thus not religious? What if I don't do that? I would, of course, be a criminal, or at the very least, a social outcast. And, according to people like Harari, deservedly so, because I'm going against the secular values society is based on and should be based on. But they don't really give you an actual reason why society should be based on secular values, other than this idea that if they're not, then we'll base them on religion, and religion is intolerant, and the idea that secularism is rational. But their proof that secularism is rational is basically, trust me, bro, secularism is rational. There's no actual evidence that secular values are rational or based on reason and evidence other than secularists saying so, and there is no actual reason to accept that they are. And there's no reason to think that religious values are inherently irrational or inherently violent or inherently divisive, other than secularists saying so. At the end of the day, they present a conflict between a person's values who follows one religion and a person's values who follow another religion as caused by religion. But when it comes to secularism, if my religious values conflict with their secular values, and I refuse to give up my religious values in favor of the secular values, if there's a conflict that is actually allowed to be a conflict, then it's purely the fault of religion and not secularism. They don't see it as a conflict between two different belief systems. They see it as secular versus religious. But at the same time, there really is no difference. And if you just strip away the language and understand that people like Guy Fawkes were not fighting simply because of a personally held belief system about gods and supernatural powers, but was fighting over things that actually mattered to him and his culture and his identity, then you begin to realize that there's not really much difference between his attempt to blow up Parliament and kill the king and a communist doing the same thing in the modern world, or even someone who's not a communist but has no particular religious views to push. The idea that religion promotes violence is simply false. Religious beliefs have often tempered violence, or even managed to completely avoid it, while secular values have often led us to bombing indiscriminately entire populations. Violence is not really something that we can pin to a word like religion or believing gods exist. It is something that happens due to a complex array of things that's never really traceable to just one thing or just one belief, but is ultimately predictable if we abandon simplistic models and simply understand human nature. In a way, although I don't agree with the scarce resource theory of violence totally, there is some truth to it, though not the one Hector Avalos put. If I'm holding this bottle of Arizona energy drink, it's not opened. Well, this one's empty, but for the sake of argument, it's not opened. It's the only one in the house. It's not in real life, but for the sake of argument. And you want it. We now have a conflict because we both want the energy drink. Does it really matter fundamentally if my argument is it's my energy drink because you have had other things to drink today? It is my turn, and because my specific allotment of the goods of this house should ensure that this particular product is used by me. Or if I justify it by saying, God has given me a fundamental right over this bottle. At the end of the day, we're still fighting over who gets the bottle of energy drink. At the end of the day, when all is said and done, the conflict is not over whether or not I have some sort of socialist right to this particular product because of how much you've eaten or drunk today, or a divine right because God said so. What matters is, I want the drink and you want the drink. The conflict is actually caused by the fact that there is one of them and both of us want it. Violence is often more complex than that, but there's more to it than just, I'm religious, therefore I'm going to kill you for not being my religion. There's always more inherent to the topic. Look at how I'm being treated and other creators are being treated right here on the tube of you. I'm having to talk funny and do weird voices and kind of move around and skip around in what I say. But I'm hoping after the 6th of November things quiet down. Probably not instantly. It takes a while to adjust algorithms and all, and they might decide not to adjust them. They might like this, but the reason I do that is because I've had videos being threatened, and I don't want to lose my channel, so I'm having to make videos that are poorer quality. But I'm hoping that settles down now after the contest and the United Avalonian States. But do you really think Gaggle has implemented its no free word choice policy because of religion? As in, it goes against their religion to allow these things? The truth of the matter is, we should probably reflect more on why these things happen, rather than try and give them simple narratives. And I know very few people have probably listened to the end of this, especially considering how long it is. But that is generally what I would like to end on. The fact that we should probably think more about what actually causes violence, rather than succumbing to simple narratives. That's all I have to say, so I'll let you go. Thank you. God bless. And goodbye.